Navy sailor is mocked in a bar until he shows his service tattoo. The Old Mariner's Pub had been a fixture in downtown Norfolk for as long as Jake Murphy could remember. It was the kind of place sailors from the naval base gravitated to after a long deployment, a place where stories were traded over whiskey and the scent of fried food mingled with the salty tang of the sea. The weathered oak bar, the low hum of music from a jukebox in the corner, and the dim yellow lights made it feel like home. To Jake, it was more than just a place to unwind after a grueling stint on the USS Chesapeake. It was a sanctuary, a slice of normalcy after months of chaotic, relentless routine. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Jake slid onto his usual bar stool with a sigh. He had been at sea for the last 4 months, navigating the turbulent waters off the coast of the Mediterranean, participating in joint exercises with NATO allies, and performing long stretches of reconnaissance patrols. Life aboard a warship was not glamorous, nor was it easy. It was a constant cycle of drills, maintenance, and long hours keeping the ship running smoothly. For a man like Jake, who had spent more time on ships than on solid ground, the bar was a sanctuary from the mechanical whine of engines and the salty winds of the open sea. He wasn't particularly eager to dive into conversation or revel in the camaraderie most sailors seemed to crave after weeks or months at sea. A quiet beer was all he wanted, a few hours to himself. As he settled into the stool, the bartender, a stout woman named Maureen who had seen more than her fair share of sailors come and go, gave him a nod of recognition. "Same as always, Jake?" she asked, already reaching for the bottle of the dark amber beer he favored. "Yeah, thanks, Maureen," Jake replied, his voice low and steady. He wasn't a man of many words. To him, words didn't mean much out here, not like they did on the ship. Out at sea, the true weight of communication came in actions, in subtle nods or a slight change in posture that told you everything you needed to know about your shipmates. The rest of the world? It was different. It was too loud, too desperate for attention. The first sip of his beer was always the best. The cold liquid slid down his throat, cool and bitter, offering a brief moment of solace from the claustrophobic confines of the ship. Jake leaned back in his stool, allowing himself to relax for the first time in months. His broad shoulders, usually stiff from hours spent in uniform, finally loosened. He took a deep breath, and for the first time since stepping off the ship, felt the weight of his body settle. The buzz of conversation filled the air around him, but it didn't bother him. He was here to observe, to be a passive participant in the ebb and flow of civilian life. It was all so different from what he had known for so long. The bar had the same warm, rustic charm as it always did. The weathered wooden floors creaked with the shuffle of boots, and the dim lighting created an intimate atmosphere that made it easy for Jake to fade into the background. He wasn't the type to seek attention. It wasn't that he disliked people, it was just that after years of service in the Navy, he found it easier to disappear into the scenery. Most people didn't notice the quiet man in the corner, sipping his beer, minding his own business. And for Jake, that was perfect. He adjusted the sleeve of his t-shirt, revealing the faded anchor tattoo on his left forearm. The ink had started to blur after all these years, but it still held its meaning. The tattoo was an old one, a mark of service, a memory of the days when he had first enlisted in the Navy as a fresh-faced 18-year-old. He had gotten it after his first year at sea, a rite of passage of sorts for those who had survived their first deployment. The anchor wasn't just a symbol of the Navy, it was a symbol of survival, of enduring long months of isolation and the relentless, unyielding ocean. It was a mark of resilience, and one Jake was proud to wear. Jake took another slow sip of his beer and let his thoughts wander back to his days on the USS Chesapeake. Life on the ship had been grueling, but it was the kind of grueling he understood. The endless routines, the camaraderie built in shared hardship, the quiet moments when everything else fell away and all that mattered was the ship, the crew, and the mission. Across the bar, a group of young men had just entered. They were dressed in clean-cut clothes, more fitting for a night out at a club than a bar like this. The first one to enter was a tall guy with sharp features, wearing a bright blue blazer and an open-collared shirt. He looked out of place in a bar filled with sailors and shipyard workers, but there was an air of cocky confidence about him, the kind that made him think he belonged here, even though he clearly didn't. The others followed, laughing loudly, their voices piercing through the murmurs of the regulars. They were young, early 20s, probably college students or recent graduates, and they had that youthful energy that Jake had long since left behind. The group took a table near the jukebox, but the loudmouth in the blue blazer quickly scanned the room and spotted Jake sitting alone at the bar. A slow smile spread across his face, as if he had found his next target. Jake's instincts told him what was coming next. He had seen it all before. "Hey, look, a real sailor," the man shouted, his voice dripping with mockery. His friends laughed in response, and Jake could feel the heat of their gazes on him, as if they were about to make him the center of their joke. "What's the matter, buddy? Got lost at sea and ended up here?" Jake didn't immediately respond. He took a slow sip of his beer and let the words wash over him. He had heard this kind of thing before, back when he was a young sailor, back when he had first enlisted and didn't yet know how to handle the ridicule of civilians. He knew how this worked. The guys who had never served would always take their shots at those who had, assuming they knew better, assuming they understood. The truth was they didn't. They never did. For a moment, Jake considered ignoring them. He had no interest in a confrontation. He wasn't looking for validation. He wasn't the kind of man who wore his uniform like a badge of pride in the civilian world. To him, it was just a job, a duty, one he had devoted his life to. But something about the way the guy in the blazer had spoken rubbed him the wrong way. There was a sneer in his voice, a dismissiveness that reminded Jake of the way people treated sailors, like they were just part of the machinery, like they didn't matter. A second man, broad-shouldered with a neck tattoo and a backward baseball cap, joined in. "What's it like out there on a boat, sailor?" he called over, slurring slightly, clearly drunk. "You just sail around, wave the flag, and pretend you're important." The word struck Jake harder than he would have liked to admit. This wasn't the first time he'd been belittled for his service, but for some reason, tonight felt different. Maybe it was the isolation of being back on land. Maybe it was the exhaustion from weeks of hard work at sea, the endless drills, the monotonous routine that made everything blur together. The long hours, the days without sleep, the moments of doubt. Jake had always dealt with the mockery with a smile or a joke in return. But tonight, the words stung in a way they hadn't in years. The group of men didn't know the first thing about the sacrifices that came with wearing the uniform. They didn't understand the loneliness of long deployments, the tension of waiting for orders that never seemed to come, the way the ship's metal hull felt like a prison at times. They didn't understand the weight of the sea, the sense of helplessness when you realized just how small you were compared to the vastness of the ocean. Most of all, they didn't understand the pride that came with being part of something much bigger than yourself. Jake's fingers tightened around his beer bottle, and for a brief moment, he felt the familiar surge of anger rise in his chest. It was a reaction he had trained himself to suppress over the years. Anger had no place in the Navy, where control and composure were paramount. But here, in this loud bar, it was harder to contain. They didn't understand, and they weren't going to. But it didn't matter. Jake had learned that over the years. What mattered was his own understanding of who he was. What mattered was what the tattoo on his arm meant to him. And tonight, he was about to make sure they understood that. The laughter continued to swell from the group of young men at the table. Jake could feel their eyes on him, their voices cutting through the ambient noise of the bar like knives. It wasn't the first time he had been mocked for his uniform, but tonight, something felt different. He had always been the kind of man to absorb insults and move on, to let the noise of the world fall away and not let it touch him. But tonight, those words, "What's the matter, buddy? Got lost at sea and ended up here?" had struck a chord. Jake glanced down at his beer, the amber liquid swirling in the bottle. He was older now, mid-30s, with more years of service under his belt than he liked to admit. He had joined the Navy straight out of high school, drawn to the sense of adventure and purpose that came with being part of something bigger than himself. But as the years had passed, he had come to realize that the adventure he had once sought was more often than not a brutal grind, a test of endurance and resilience. The Navy had shaped him into the man he was, but it had also taken from him in ways he hadn't expected. It had taken away his sense of self, buried deep beneath endless drills, deployments, and the suffocating sense of duty that never seemed to end. For the longest time, Jake had been content to let the outside world think of him as just another sailor, a cog in the machine. He didn't need their validation. But now, as the group of men continued to laugh and jeer at him from across the bar, Jake felt a wave of frustration that he hadn't felt in years. The loud-mouthed guy in the blue blazer had singled him out, just like all the others who couldn't understand what it meant to be a sailor, to serve on the open seas, to give so much of yourself to a life that didn't leave much room for anything else. It wasn't just the mockery that stung. It was the fact that, after all these years of service, Jake felt like an outsider in his own world. On the ship, he had purpose, mission, and camaraderie. But on land,
he was just a man with a tattoo and a uniform.
To the people here, that was all he was, a sailor with no real identity beyond his job. They didn't see the years of sacrifice, the moments of terror and exhaustion, the quiet pride that came with the insignia he wore on his chest and the anchor that adorned his arm. Jake had never been one to wear his identity on his sleeve, literally or figuratively. He didn't need to tell anyone about the 12-hour shifts, the endless watches on the bridge in the dead of night, or the times he had been sent into stormy waters with nothing but his crew to rely on. That was part of the deal when you joined the Navy. You were part of something bigger, a small piece of a vast machine that kept the world turning. But in this moment, he realized just how little the world outside the Navy understood the toll it took. How little they cared. The loud-mouthed guy in the blue blazer was still grinning across the room. His words had been a thinly veiled challenge, a dare to respond. Jake wasn't sure what had sparked this particular bout of contempt. Maybe it was the way the man had looked at him, as though his uniform were some kind of costume, some silly getup that wasn't worthy of respect. Maybe it was the way he had dismissed Jake without knowing a thing about him or his life. It was the kind of look that was often reserved for people who saw others as less than they were, a look that reminded Jake of the many times he had been underestimated in his career. There was a time, when Jake was younger, that he would have fired back immediately. He had grown up on the rough streets of South Boston, where confrontation was as common as the rising sun. But after more than a decade in the Navy, Jake had learned to pick his battles. He had seen enough to know that a shouting match in a bar wasn't worth his time. The Navy had taught him the importance of discipline, of keeping his emotions in check, of choosing the right moment to act. He had learned to let things slide, to walk away when others tried to provoke him. But tonight, something inside him stirred. Something about this man, this group of strangers, seemed to push all the wrong buttons. Maybe it was the loneliness of being back on land, the sense of disconnection he often felt in civilian life. Or maybe it was the years of fighting for respect that had led to this moment, this desperate need to show these men that being a sailor wasn't something to be mocked, it was something to be earned. Jake looked at the man in the blue blazer again. He was laughing with his friends, clearly reveling in the attention he was getting, but there was a glint in his eyes, a look of superiority that made Jake want to stand up and slam his fist on the table. It was the kind of arrogance that Jake had seen before, back in the days when he had first enlisted, when the world seemed full of people who thought they knew everything, yet understood nothing. "Hey, sailor," the man called out again, this time with more force, as if he had forgotten that Jake hadn't answered him the first time. "What's it like, huh? You just wake up every day and stare out at the water, pretending to be important? You think the world needs more guys like you." The words were casual, but Jake felt their sting. They weren't just mocking his service. They were mocking his entire existence, the choices he had made that had led him to this moment. The man didn't understand what it took to be in the Navy, what it meant to dedicate your life to something larger than yourself. The man didn't understand the price that came with wearing a uniform and bearing the weight of the world on your shoulders, day after day, year after year. But what hurt the most was the underlying implication that it wasn't a real job, that Jake wasn't a real person, but just another cog in a machine. Jake could feel the anger bubbling up inside him. He wasn't angry about the comment itself. He had heard worse from fellow sailors who were just as eager to prove their toughness. What made him angry was the assumption that he wasn't deserving of respect. It was as if the man believed that his position in life, whatever it was somehow more important than Jake's service. That his suit and his smooth words carried more weight than the years of sacrifice Jake had made. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that Jake had spent more time on the ocean than most people spent in their whole lives. He had been a part of something that mattered. He had fought for his country, had seen the world from a vantage point few people ever would. And yet here he was, sitting in a bar, being mocked by someone who had no idea what it meant to serve. Jake took a slow breath and tried to calm himself. He knew that responding with anger would only give this man the satisfaction he was looking for. But the words were like a spark in a dry forest, and Jake felt himself teetering on the edge of something dangerous. He wasn't a man who liked to fight. He had seen enough violence to last a lifetime. But he was also a man who couldn't let others trample over his dignity without a response. He took another sip of his beer, trying to steady his nerves. The bartender, Maureen, had been watching the scene unfold from behind the bar, her eyes flicking between Jake and the group of men. She was no stranger to sailors, but she could tell that this was more than just a random encounter. Something about this group was different. She had seen the way they'd looked at Jake when they came in, mocking, dismissive, as though they had already decided who he was before he had even opened his mouth. She could tell that Jake wasn't the type to get into a fight, but she also knew that a sailor's pride could only take so much. "Don't let them get to you, Jake," she said quietly, leaning over the counter. Her voice was low enough that only he could hear it. "They're just kids. They don't know any better." Jake didn't answer right away. He just stared at his beer, the bubbles rising and popping in the dim light. For a moment, the weight of her words settled into him. She was right. They didn't know. They didn't know what it was like to live and breathe the Navy, to see things they would never understand, to experience the kind of hardship that forged a sailor's character. But that didn't change the fact that something inside him had been triggered, something he hadn't let resurface in years. He had to make them understand. He had to show them that what he did mattered. Jake's fingers tightened around the bottle, the cool glass now slick with condensation, his knuckles white as he fought to maintain control. It had been years since he'd let someone get under his skin like this, but the words of the young man in the blue blazer felt like a jab to the gut, sharp, sudden, and unrelenting. He'd been able to ignore the teasing before, even the condescending questions. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't entirely understand, he felt the simmering frustration inside him rise to the surface. And it wasn't just because of the mockery. It was something deeper, a feeling of being alienated, like a stranger in a world that no longer made sense. Jake had always kept himself in situations like this. He had spent the better part of his life on ships, surrounded by fellow sailors who, for better or worse, understood him, understood the unspoken bond forged in the crucible of shared hardship. But here, in this bar, he was alone in a way that he hadn't been in years. The group of young men, laughing like they owned the room, seemed to represent everything he resented about civilian life: shallow, entitled, and blissfully unaware of the sacrifices made by people like him. It was as if they had no concept of what it meant to be part of something larger than yourself. The bartender, Maureen, had tried to give him some comfort, her words intended to soothe, to pull him back from the edge. She was right, they didn't know. But that didn't change the fact that tonight, of all nights, he had reached a breaking point. And in that moment, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment he needed to prove something, to show them all what it meant to be a sailor. Not just a uniformed man sitting in the corner, but a man who had earned the right to wear that uniform. Jake stood up slowly, the movement deliberate, like a predator preparing to confront its prey. His shoulders were stiff, but there was a quiet resolve in his step that spoke of a man who had long since learned to hold his ground. He didn't look at Maureen as he moved past her, didn't acknowledge the soft concern in her eyes. This wasn't about her. This wasn't even about the men in the bar. This was about him. About reclaiming something he hadn't realized he had lost, his sense of pride, his confidence in himself as a man who had fought and sacrificed for something that truly mattered. As Jake made his way across the floor toward the group of men, the noise in the bar seemed to fade away, replaced by the thrum of adrenaline in his chest. His movements were smooth, unhurried, but there was a certain intensity to them, as if every step was calculated, every inch closer to the table of victory in and of itself. The men hadn't noticed him yet. They were still laughing, still caught up in their own little world, oblivious to the man who was about to insert himself into it. The man in the blue blazer was the first to see Jake coming. His eyes flickered up, and for a moment, there was a look of confusion on his face, like he couldn't quite understand why Jake was approaching them. But then, as if he had anticipated this, the expression shifted into one of amusement. The guy smiled, a sharp, self-assured grin, and leaned back in his chair as if he were settling into the role of the master of ceremonies for the show he was sure was about to unfold. "Look who decided to join us," the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's the matter, sailor? You looking for a fight?" Jake didn't answer. He wasn't here to waste time on words. He had already made up his mind. He wasn't just going to respond to the taunts. No, tonight he was going to force them to listen. He was going to make them understand. The group of young men at the table had grown quiet now, sensing the shift in energy. They could feel the tension building, could see the change in Jake's posture. The laughing had stopped, replaced by an uneasy silence. But Jake didn't need their approval. He didn't need their respect. Not anymore. "Do you know what it means to serve?" Jake's voice was low, but there was a steady firmness to it, a controlled rage simmering beneath the surface. He wasn't shouting, he didn't need to. The words were measured, deliberate, as if he had been rehearsing them in his head for years, waiting for the moment when they would matter. "Do you know what it's like to spend months at sea, away from everything you've ever known, doing a job that no one else wants to do? Do you understand what it means to sacrifice?" The young man in the blue blazer cocked his head, a smirk still playing at the corners of his mouth. He clearly didn't understand. Jake could see it in his eyes, the blank confusion, the condescending pity. To this man, the uniform was just that, a uniform. A costume. Something to be mocked, something to be dismissed. "Yeah, sure, I get it," the man said, waving a hand dismissively, as if trying to swat away the seriousness of Jake's words. "You get to play soldier, sail around the world, act like you're some big deal. But what does that even mean? What do you really do? Sit around on your boat and pretend you're important?" Jake's jaw clenched. It took all his restraint not to snap back at the man with something that would end in a fight. But he knew better. He had learned over the years that violence solved nothing. This wasn't about proving his strength. This was about something far more personal. It was about showing this man and everyone else in this room that the life he had chosen, no, the life he had given himself to, was worth more than the cheap, shallow judgments of someone who had never experienced a fraction of what he had. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. The group of young men was watching him now, their expressions shifting from bemusement to wariness. They could feel the tension in the air, the weight of his words hanging over them like a storm cloud. "You don't get it," Jake said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "I didn't choose this life to feel important. I didn't choose it for recognition. I chose it because it's my duty. It's a life of service, of putting others before yourself. You think you're better than me because you get to sit in a bar and talk about whatever you want. But you don't know what it's like to fight for something, to fight for your country, your brothers, and the people who are counting on you. You don't know what it's like to face the ocean every single day, not knowing if you're going to make it back. You don't know what it's like to lose people you care about and keep going because that's what you signed up for. You don't know." There was a long pause. For a moment, the group of young men sat in stunned silence. The confidence that had been there just moments before had faded, replaced by a dawning recognition, a flicker of understanding, perhaps, though they would never fully grasp the depth of Jake's words. They had no idea what it meant to sacrifice in the way he had. They didn't understand what it was like to put your life on the line for people you had never met, for ideals that seemed intangible and distant. But for Jake, that was the core of who he was. The man in the blue blazer shifted in his seat, his smug grin now replaced by an uncomfortable shift in his posture. It wasn't exactly remorse, but it was close enough. Jake could see it in the way he avoided eye contact, the way the others around the table fidgeted, unsure how to react. Jake didn't wait for their response. He knew that some things couldn't be explained in a few words. He had already said what he needed to say. His mission in that moment had been to make them understand, at least a little bit, what it meant to be a sailor, to live a life of service, to endure the challenges that came with it. And as he turned to walk back to the bar, he knew he had done something he hadn't done in years. He had reclaimed his dignity, his pride. As Jake made his way back to his seat, he could feel the weight of the stairs following him. The group at the table was still silent, but there was a shift in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that something had changed. They didn't understand him completely, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he had made them see him. Truly see him. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had made a difference. As Jake returned to his seat, he felt a strange tension, a knot in his stomach that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the usual unease he felt after an encounter like this. No, it was something deeper, something new. It was a restless, unsettled feeling that refused to fade. He had never been the kind of man to seek validation, to chase respect or recognition. The Navy had taught him long ago that self-worth came from within. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, he had realized how much of himself he had allowed to slip away into the shadows, forgotten and ignored by the world around him. He sat back down at the bar, his fingers gripping the bottle once more, his mind spinning with the events that had just unfolded. He hadn't expected the encounter to go like that. He hadn't expected to find his voice, much less to stand up to the mocking words of strangers. The strange thing was, as soon as he'd said those words, those raw, unfiltered truths about what it meant to serve, he had felt a shift within himself. Like a pressure valve had been released. Like something inside him had been reawakened. But that feeling, as powerful as it was, didn't last. Jake's gaze flickered around the bar, the same dimly lit space he'd been in countless times before. The voices of the patrons felt distant now, muffled by the weight of his own thoughts. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the soft hum of conversation, all of it felt hollow. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the lingering stares of the men at the table who had been so quick to judge him. It wasn't a malicious gaze, but there was an edge to it, a quiet recognition that perhaps they hadn't understood him, or anyone like him, before tonight. The bartender, Maureen, had moved on to another customer, but she kept glancing at him from behind the counter. Jake could tell she was concerned. Her eyes were soft, sympathetic. She wasn't one to pry, but he could see the curiosity in her gaze. He wasn't sure if he wanted to explain it all to her, to tell her what had been stirring inside him for so long. But he wasn't ready to unpack it yet. Not tonight. Not when the world outside still felt so alien. Jake took another sip from his beer. The cold liquid burned as it slid down his throat, a familiar sensation that, for a moment, grounded him in the present. The noise of the bar began to seep back into his consciousness, but it didn't feel the same anymore. There was a distance between himself and the people in the room, as if he were observing them from the outside, looking in on a world he had once belonged to but had drifted too far from. It wasn't just the mocking remarks from the group of young men that unsettled him. It was the realization that, in that moment, he had felt vulnerable, exposed. That wasn't a feeling Jake was accustomed to. Vulnerability wasn't something you could afford in the Navy. It wasn't a luxury that soldiers could indulge in when the stakes were so high. In the military, you kept your emotions in check, you hardened your heart, and you moved forward. That was how you survived. But here, in this bar, in this civilian world, the rules were different. The expectations were different. Jake wasn't used to being surrounded by people who didn't understand the weight of his experiences, who didn't grasp the subtle intricacies of a life that had been shaped by the sea. Back on the ship, he knew his role. He knew his place. He knew the rhythm of life on board, the unspoken bonds, the shared sacrifices, the camaraderie that kept them all going. When you served with someone, you didn't need to ask questions. You didn't need to explain. Everyone just knew. But here, everything felt out of place. The laughter that echoed through the bar wasn't filled with the same warmth as the conversations he had shared with his crew. The banter didn't come from a place of understanding. It came from a place of ignorance. And the worst part was that Jake hadn't known how to respond. He had known how to make them understand that the life he had chosen was not just a job. It was a way of being, a way of living that required sacrifice, resilience, and an unspoken understanding that was hard to explain in a few words. Jake's mind wandered back to his younger self when he first joined the Navy. He had been full of ambition, full of hope. He had believed that the world would recognize him for the service he was giving. He had believed that the uniform would command respect, that the title of sailor would earn him a place in the world, somewhere among the ranks of the men and women who had also given their all to something larger than themselves. But as the years passed, the harsh truth had set in. Respect wasn't automatic. Recognition wasn't guaranteed. And the world often had no idea what it took to serve. In that moment, Jake realized that the Navy had changed him, not just in the ways it had hardened his body or sharpened his skills, but in how it had shaped his expectations of the world. It had made him a man of purpose, but it had also made him a man who no longer fit into the world he had once known. His connection to civilian life had been frayed over the years, and the gap between the two had only widened. The weight of duty, the constant vigilance, the hours spent in the quiet, relentless rhythm of military life, it was all so far removed from the noise of a bar on a Friday night, surrounded by people who had never experienced even a fraction of what he had. Jake leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. He could still hear the echoes of laughter from the table across the room. The man in the blue blazer was still there, still surrounded by his friends, still playing the role of the guy who had it all figured out. But Jake wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking past him, looking beyond the surface of what had happened tonight, and seeing something deeper, something that he had been avoiding for far too long. It wasn't the ridicule that had bothered him. It was the fact that, for a moment, he had let himself believe that it mattered. He had let the words of some stranger affect him in a way that he hadn't allowed in years. That was what he needed to understand. That was what he needed to change. The judgment of others, the misunderstanding, it no longer had a place in his life. He had already proven his worth. The people who mattered, the ones who knew what it meant to serve, already understood. Jake's hands gripped the edge of the bar as he sat up straighter. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let the experience of tonight fester into something that would eat at him. He had already taken a step forward by confronting the group, by standing up for himself. And now he needed to take another step, this time, not for them, but for himself. He glanced back at the table where the men sat. They had gone quiet again, their earlier bravado replaced by an awkward tension. The man in the blue blazer was looking at him, his expression no longer mocking, but thoughtful. Jake didn't feel vindicated, not exactly. There was no sense of triumph, no feeling of superiority. But there was something else, a quiet sense of resolution. He had spoken his truth, and whether or not they understood, that truth would remain. A few minutes passed, and Jake finished his beer. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he knew he had to keep moving forward. The night wasn't over, and the world hadn't shifted completely. But in that small moment, as he sat in the bar, he felt a shift within himself. The weight he had been carrying, the weight of silence, of unspoken anger, of years spent buried in the routine of military life, was beginning to lift. It wasn't gone, not yet, but it was fading. And that was a start. As he stood up to leave, he caught Maureen's eye. She nodded at him, her expression soft but knowing. Jake didn't say anything, didn't need to. He knew she understood that something had changed in him tonight. Something he hadn't expected, but something he needed. He made his way toward the door, his movements slow but purposeful. He wasn't looking for a confrontation. He wasn't looking for answers. But he was looking for peace, a peace that had eluded him for too long. And as he stepped out into the cool night air, Jake realized that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, more encounters that would test him. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face them. Not because he was some hero, not because the world owed him anything, but because in this moment, he finally understood that the life he had chosen, the life he had given everything for, had value. And no one, not even a room full of strangers, could take that away from him. The door closed softly behind Jake as he stepped back into the cool night air, the noise of the bar fading behind him like the distant roar of a tide retreating into the horizon. It felt different out here, on the other side of the threshold, as though the world had shifted imperceptibly. His steps echoed against the sidewalk, and the sharp night air bit at his skin, clearing his head. The brief encounter had felt like a wave crashing over him, intense, overwhelming, and bracing. But now that he was out of the immediate chaos, the crash of adrenaline subsided, and with it came a deeper, more uncomfortable realization. Jake had wanted respect. That much was clear now. He had wanted to prove something to the young men in the bar, something about who he was, about the life he had lived. He had been aching for that validation, craving the recognition of his sacrifices, his service. It was the same need that had driven him to speak out, to confront the mocking stares and dismissive remarks with the raw honesty he hadn't allowed himself to express in years. He had thought that by telling them, by laying bare the depths of his experience, they would understand. They would see him. But now, as he walked away, the sense of victory that had surged through him in the moment felt hollow, empty. It wasn't just that he hadn't received the acknowledgement he'd hoped for. It was that the acknowledgement, the validation itself, had turned out to be a mirage, a fleeting illusion that had evaporated the moment he walked out the door. Jake stopped at the corner of the street and looked back over his shoulder. The bar still hummed with activity, but the noise felt distant now, as though it had nothing to do with him anymore. The group of men, the ones who had laughed at him, who had looked at him as if he were just some relic in a faded uniform, were probably still there, still joking among themselves. Their laughter had shifted since he confronted them. Less mocking, more contemplative, but Jake didn't need to know the details. He didn't need to know what they were saying. What mattered was what he had felt in that moment. And what he had felt wasn't pride. It wasn't a sense of accomplishment or triumph. It was something else entirely, uncertainty. Jake continued walking down the street, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what had gone wrong, or, rather, what had not gone right. He had been prepared for their scorn, for their mockery, for the way they would laugh him off. But he hadn't been prepared for the way their silence had unsettled him. He hadn't been prepared for the way their uneasy glances had felt like a judgment in themselves, as though his words had fallen on deaf ears, and he had failed to convey the depth of what he had wanted to express. What he had wanted was simple. He had wanted respect. He had wanted them to acknowledge his sacrifice, to see him not as just another man in a uniform, but as someone who had truly earned his place in the world. He had wanted them to understand that his life was one of purpose, that his service wasn't just some arbitrary choice. It was a commitment, a vocation that had shaped every part of him. And when they looked at him, when they questioned him, he had wanted to show them what that really meant. But now, as the cold air nipped at his face and the city lights blinked lazily in the distance, Jake realized that something else had happened. He had spoken the truth, yes. He had revealed the weight of his life to them, but what did it matter if they didn't get it? What did it matter if they didn't understand, if they didn't grasp the significance of what he had shared? He hadn't achieved what he thought he wanted. Not the validation, not the understanding. No, what he had achieved was something far less tangible, something that hadn't given him the sense of satisfaction he had been hoping for. Instead of a sense of victory, Jake felt the heavy weight of disappointment settling in his chest, the kind of disappointment that came not from losing something, but from realizing that you'd spent so much time chasing the wrong thing in the first place. Jake had been so focused on their perception of him, on their recognition of his worth, that he had lost sight of the one thing that truly mattered, his own perception of himself. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but in that moment, he understood it with clarity. What he had wanted wasn't recognition from strangers. It wasn't a fleeting sense of validation that would quickly fade as they moved on to the next topic of conversation. What he had needed, what he had been craving, was something far deeper, something that could not be given to him by a group of bargoers who didn't know him, who didn't understand him, and frankly, didn't care to. Jake didn't need them to see him. He needed to see himself again. His thoughts turned inward. He thought of his years in the Navy, of the long stretches at sea, the days when everything felt like a blur of monotony and tension. He thought of the faces of the men he had served with, the ones who had become his brothers in arms, the ones who had shared the dangers, the camaraderie, the sacrifices. Those were the men who had understood him, who had seen the person behind the uniform. Not because they had to, but because they had lived it with him. They had known what it was to give themselves to something greater than themselves, to sacrifice and endure in ways that few civilians ever could. It wasn't that Jake resented the civilians, or the way they lived. It wasn't even that he wanted to separate himself from them entirely. It was that the life he had led had been so far removed from the everyday experiences of others that he couldn't expect them to understand. He had been so consumed by the desire to prove himself to them, to make them understand what his life had been about, that he had forgotten the most important thing. His sense of self-worth didn't depend on their approval. Jake stopped at a streetlight and leaned against a lamppost. The coldness of the metal seeped through his jacket, but he didn't care. His mind was racing, his emotions turbulent. He had achieved what he thought was victory. He had stood up for himself. He had spoken his truth. But what did it matter if that truth hadn't been received in the way he had hoped? What did it matter if they hadn't acknowledged it? The world wasn't going to give him the recognition he craved. It was a lesson he should have known by now. The question now was, where did he go from here? He had been chasing something external, something that could be given or taken away. But in doing so, he had lost sight of the internal struggle, the one that was far more important than the validation of strangers. His service had always been about something deeper than recognition. It had always been about a commitment to something larger than himself. But somewhere along the way, Jake had forgotten that. He had forgotten that his identity as a sailor, as a man of service, was rooted in something far more enduring than the fleeting opinions of others. Jake pushed away from the lamppost and started walking again, his footsteps firm but slow. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, or if he was even looking for anything at all. All he knew was that the night had changed something in him. The conversation with the men at the bar had been more of a mirror than a confrontation. They hadn't been the ones who needed to change, it was him. It was Jake who had been chasing the wrong thing all along. In the distance, the faint hum of the city carried on, but Jake was no longer listening to it with the same urgency. He wasn't concerned with what others thought of him. What mattered now was the quiet, steady understanding that had begun to settle in his chest. He didn't need them to understand. He didn't need them to validate his sacrifices. What he needed was to find peace within himself. And in that moment, Jake knew that peace could only come from one place, from within. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need to seek validation from strangers or acquaintances. What he needed was to remember who he had always been, to remember why he had chosen the path he did in the first place. His service was not a commodity to be traded for respect, it was a calling. And that calling had always been enough. The walk home was long, but Jake didn't mind. He didn't need to rush anymore. The false victory of the night had faded, and in its place was a quiet understanding. The recognition he had sought wasn't coming, but he didn't need it. Not anymore. The days following Jake's confrontation in the bar felt like a blur. He moved through them on autopilot, caught in a fog of disillusionment that clouded his every thought. There was a restlessness in his chest, a gnawing emptiness that refused to be quieted by anything. The adrenaline rush of speaking his truth had faded, leaving behind a hollow ache that was becoming increasingly hard to ignore. He had done what he thought was necessary. He had confronted the mockery, had faced down the strangers who had belittled him, and in doing so, he had expected to feel some sense of triumph. Instead, he felt nothing. In the following days, the city around him seemed quieter, more distant. His interactions with others, his friends, his colleagues, even strangers, felt superficial, like a series of fleeting exchanges that held no real substance. It wasn't that he was lonely. He had always been good at keeping people at arm's length, at maintaining the distance necessary to protect himself from becoming too attached to anyone. No, what Jake felt wasn't loneliness. It was an intense isolation that stemmed from the realization that the life he had chosen, the life he had devoted himself to, wasn't something that could be understood by those around him. He had always been the kind of man who kept his emotions in check, who didn't let himself be swayed by the opinions of others. But now, all of a sudden, the opinions of others seemed to matter more than he cared to admit. Jake had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on not needing anyone's validation to feel secure in his choices. But this moment, this confrontation, had revealed something he had never been prepared for. It wasn't just about proving himself to strangers or to the men in the bar. It was about something deeper, something more ingrained. It was about the way he had allowed the world around him to dictate his self-worth, the way he had allowed himself to become defined by others' perceptions.
He had thought he could escape that.
He had thought that by confronting them, by standing his ground, he would feel free. But in doing so, he had only exposed the cracks in his own sense of self. And now, those cracks were beginning to widen. At first, the toll was subtle. He began to withdraw from the people he used to interact with easily. He stopped going to the gym with his old buddies, skipping out on invitations to drink or grab dinner. He found himself unable to shake the lingering sense of regret from the bar. His pride, his desire to be understood, had cost him something he wasn't fully prepared to lose. Not only had he failed to achieve the validation he so desperately wanted, but in the process, he had exposed a part of himself he didn't even know existed. The part of him that was vulnerable, that was desperate for connection, for recognition, for the approval of people who would never truly understand the weight of what he carried. And the worst part? He didn't know how to undo it. One afternoon, a week after the encounter, Jake found himself at a quiet cafe, seated at a small table by the window, watching the people pass by outside. The coffee in front of him had long since gone cold, but he hadn't touched it. His mind was elsewhere, caught in a loop of thoughts he couldn't escape. The steady hum of conversation around him felt like a constant reminder that the world was moving on, that life was continuing without him. And yet he was stuck. As the days passed, the regret festered. He hadn't intended to become consumed by it, but the weight of his own disappointment had taken hold. His need for external validation had, in a sense, eroded the very thing he had spent years building, his sense of identity. Jake had always defined himself by his service, by the uniform he wore, by the commitment he had made to the Navy. It had been his purpose, his mission. But somewhere along the way, he had started to mistake that sense of purpose for something more fragile, the need to prove his worth to those who would never truly understand what he had given up. And that mistake had come at a cost. Jake was no longer certain who he was without the approval of others. He realized that in his pursuit of validation, he had neglected the deeper, quieter aspects of his identity, the parts of him that didn't need to be seen by others to be valid. And now, in the silence of his apartment, in the stillness of his thoughts, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something important in the process. His pride, his need to prove himself, had come at the expense of his own peace of mind. It had created a tension inside him that had never been there before, a constant pull between the man he had been and the man he thought he needed to be. The true cost of his actions became evident as the weeks wore on. Jake began to feel the fracture in his relationships, the slow unraveling of the connections he had once held dear. He had always kept his emotional distance from people, but it had never felt like a barrier until now. He had spent years building a wall around himself, a wall that protected him from the judgment of others. But now, the wall was crumbling, and what lay beneath it wasn't strength or resilience, it was fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of rejection, fear of the deep loneliness that came from knowing that no matter how much you gave, no matter how much you sacrificed, you would never be fully understood by the people around you. Jake's relationship with his closest friend, Marcus, began to deteriorate. Marcus had been a fellow sailor, someone who had shared the hardships and victories of life in the Navy. But now, their conversations seemed forced, their interactions strained. Marcus had always known Jake as someone who was emotionally reserved, someone who didn't let his guard down easily. But now, there was a distance between them that neither of them could ignore. Jake didn't know how to explain what had happened to him, how this need for validation, this hunger for respect, had slowly consumed him, leaving him hollow. But Marcus had noticed the change. He had noticed Jake pulling away, withdrawing into himself. "What's going on with you, man?" Marcus had asked one evening over beers, his tone laced with concern. "You've been acting off lately. You're not yourself." Jake had wanted to brush it off, to tell Marcus that everything was fine, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, He had just stared at his beer, the cold glass in his hand a faint reminder of the things he couldn't hold onto anymore. "I'm fine," he'd said eventually, but the words felt empty even as he said them. In the silence that followed, Jake realized how much he had lost. Not just the fleeting validation of strangers, not just the approval of people who didn't understand him, but something more important, the connections that had once grounded him. The people who had been his friends, his brothers, who had known him for who he truly was, were now starting to feel like strangers. And it wasn't because they had changed, it was because Jake had. He had shifted, subtly at first, but now it was undeniable. In his attempt to prove himself to the world, Jake had pushed away the very people who had always supported him. The cost of that had been higher than he had realized. He had been so focused on gaining respect from strangers that he had lost the respect of those who mattered most, the people who had known him, truly known him, for the man he was beneath the uniform. The emotional price was compounded by a deeper, more existential realization. Jake had been running from something for years. The Navy had been a way to escape, to bury the parts of himself that he didn't want to confront. He had buried his fears, his doubts, his insecurities beneath the weight of duty. But the more he chased external validation, the more he realized that no amount of recognition would ever fill the emptiness that had been festering within him for so long. The validation of strangers could never heal the wounds he had been ignoring within himself. He had been looking for the wrong kind of recognition. What he needed wasn't approval, it was acceptance. Acceptance of who he was, acceptance of the choices he had made, and, perhaps most importantly, acceptance of the parts of himself that he had never wanted to face. As the weeks wore on, Jake found himself questioning everything. The weight of his choices, the disillusionment that came with them, was starting to sink in. He had gotten what he thought he wanted, the confrontation, the truth spoken, but now, in the aftermath, he realized that what he had really been seeking all along was peace, not praise. But peace wasn't something that could be found in the approval of others. Peace, he began to understand, could only be found within himself. The price of his pursuit had been high, fractured relationships, a damaged sense of self-worth, and the growing realization that the external validation he sought could never heal the internal wounds he had long ignored. And now, more than ever, Jake understood the true cost of seeking validation from others. It wasn't just emotional distance. It was the loss of the one thing that had always been within his control, his own sense of self. The morning light crept through the blinds of Jake's apartment, casting faint, slanted rays across the wooden floor. The sunlight wasn't quite warm enough to break through the coolness that still clung to the air, but it was enough to stir something in him. A feeling, a shift. For the first time in weeks, Jake didn't feel an overwhelming urge to push the world away, to retreat into himself, or to drown out the noise of his thoughts with distractions. It was as if the emotional weight he had been carrying, the confusion, the regret, the disappointment, had finally begun to lift, slowly, gently, like fog burning off under the morning sun. Jake hadn't been sleeping well lately. Not because of nightmares or old memories of his time in the Navy, though there were still days when those crept in uninvited, but because his mind had been so full of questions, of reflections on what had happened. He had spent weeks ruminating on his interactions, his conversations, and the realization that had begun to settle heavily on his chest. He was not the man he had once been. The realization came slowly at first, in fleeting moments of self-doubt and regret. But now it was something solid, something undeniable. Jake had been seeking validation from the wrong places. He had thought that in confronting those men at the bar, in speaking his truth, he would find something, respect, recognition, perhaps even closure. Instead, he had found something far more uncomfortable, the truth about himself. And that truth had hit him harder than any battle he had ever faced in his life. The person he had been before that confrontation, the man who prided himself on being self-sufficient, unshakable, emotionally distant, was gone. In his place was something more fragile, more human, something he had been trying to avoid for years, the desire for connection, for belonging. It wasn't easy to admit, not to himself and certainly not to others. But Jake was beginning to understand that it wasn't weakness to want connection, it was human. He had spent so much of his life building walls around his emotions, around his identity, that he had forgotten what it meant to be vulnerable, to let others see who he truly was. The confrontation at the bar had been a wake-up call, but it wasn't just the mocking laughter that had jolted him awake. It was the realization that in his attempt to prove himself to strangers, he had lost sight of what really mattered. He had lost the sense of peace and purpose that had once grounded him in his service. It wasn't respect he was after, it was acceptance. Jake had always defined himself by his role in the Navy, by the uniform he wore, by the sacrifices he had made. But those things, though important, were not the sum of who he was. He had thought they were. But now, as he stood in the quiet of his apartment, looking out over the city, he realized that he had been looking for validation in all the wrong places. He had been seeking something external to define his worth. But the truth was that his worth didn't come from the respect of strangers or the approval of others. His worth came from within, from the choices he had made, from the sacrifices he had endured, from the quiet moments of reflection that had shaped him. Jake took a slow breath, the realization sinking deeper into him. He didn't need others to understand him. He didn't need them to validate his past or to approve of the choices he had made. What mattered was that he understood himself. What mattered was that he accepted who he had become, both the parts of him he was proud of and the parts that he had once tried to hide. Over the next few days, Jake began to embrace the quiet power of acceptance. He didn't rush into anything. He didn't immediately make sweeping changes to his life or his routines. He didn't try to force himself into any one mold or another. Instead, he allowed himself to simply be. He spent time alone, reflecting on the lessons he had learned, taking long walks through the city and remembering what it had been like before the military, before all of the expectations. There were moments of doubt, moments where he questioned whether he could truly let go of the need for validation, but they were fleeting. Slowly, the old, more distant version of himself began to fade, replaced by someone quieter, more at peace. One afternoon, Jake visited the old cafe where he had spent countless hours alone before his time in the Navy. It was a place that held a lot of memories for him, of simpler times, of reflections, of days when he had been someone else. As he walked inside, he was greeted by the familiar scent of coffee and the hum of casual conversations. The barista behind the counter recognized him immediately, offering a friendly smile as she made his usual order. For the first time in months, Jake didn't feel the rush of anxiety that used to grip him when he walked into a public space. He didn't feel the need to measure himself against others, to seek approval or make an impression. He just was. Sitting at his table by the window, Jake sipped his coffee, looking out at the people walking by. He didn't feel alone, nor did he feel disconnected from the world around him. It was as though, for the first time in years, he was truly present. He wasn't wrapped up in the judgment of others, nor was he focused on how others saw him. He was simply existing in the moment, content in his own company. The guilt that had once gnawed at him, guilt about the choices he had made, about the friendships he had lost, about the confrontation at the bar, began to fade. It wasn't that he had forgotten. It was that he had made peace with it. That evening, Jake received a text message from Marcus. They hadn't spoken much in the past few weeks, and Jake had avoided initiating any conversation. He wasn't sure how to bridge the gap that had formed between them, or whether it even could be bridged. But Marcus' message was simple. "Hey man, wanna grab a drink tomorrow? We haven't caught up in a while." Jake stared at the message for a long moment, his finger hovering over the keys. It was tempting to ignore it, to continue keeping his distance, to keep playing the role of the emotionally distant ex-sailor who didn't need anyone. But something inside him told him that this was the moment to act differently, to embrace the change that had taken place inside him. So he typed a response. "Yeah, let's meet."
I'd like that.
The next day, they met at a pub that they used to frequent together during their time in the Navy. The atmosphere was familiar, the same old faces behind the bar, the same buzz of laughter and clinking glasses. But something had shifted. Jake no longer felt the need to pretend, to distance himself, or to hide his emotions. When Marcus greeted him, there was a genuine warmth in his expression. No judgment, no expectations. It felt like they were picking up right where they had left off, but with something new between them. honesty. They sat down at a quiet corner table, and after the usual small talk, Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Jake for a moment. "You've seemed a little off lately," he said cautiously. "What's been going on with you?" Jake paused, his fingers wrapping around his beer as he collected his thoughts. For the first time, he realized that he didn't have to hide. He didn't have to brush things off or deflect. He could speak honestly. "I've been trying to figure some things out," he said slowly. "I guess I got caught up in trying to prove myself to people who don't even know me.
And it cost me more than I realized.
My head's been a mess for a while now." Marcus didn't interrupt, just nodded. "I get that," he said softly. "You've always been the kind of guy who doesn't ask for much from others, but it's okay to need something. To need people." Jake swallowed hard, the words sticking in his throat for a moment. "I think I've been running from a lot of things," he admitted, his voice low. "Things I didn't want to face. And I thought if I could just get other people to understand, it would make everything make sense. But it doesn't work like that. It's not about other people. It's about accepting myself." Marcus gave him a thoughtful look, then grinned. "Sounds like you've learned something important." Jake nodded slowly, the weight in his chest finally beginning to ease. "Yeah," he said, his voice firm now. "I think I've finally figured it out. I don't need to prove anything to anyone. I just need to be okay with who I am." The conversation drifted from there, but something had changed. Jake no longer felt like an outsider to himself, and for the first time in months, he felt at peace with the person he was. He wasn't chasing validation anymore. He wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.